Fashion Week of Rochester is in full swing, showcasing the work and talent of local clothing designers. That Fashion Week concept, which is celebrated by cities around the globe, was first introduced by legendary fashion publicist, the late Eleanor Lambert. Lambert is credited for putting American fashion on the global map. Renowned fashion historian, author, and lecturer John A. Tiffany beautifully captures Lambert's story and legacy in his book, Eleanor Lambert, Still Here. Tiffany stopped by the WXXI studios during a recent visit to Western New York to share Lambert's story, give us a glimpse into his new work, and to explain the impact of clothing on our culture, our society, and our lives. Take a look. When it comes to renowned fashion historians, John, I am quite certain that you are the first to grace the Need to Know set, so welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And I'm sure viewers are intrigued with you and what you do and how you believe fashion influences our world. So just to begin, explain to me how you got into this profession and the life of a fashion historian.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a very small town in California that was obsessed with horses, horseback riding, whether you rode Western or English, or what sports you were in, and I was in none of those. And a teacher that I had in high school, who actually dedicated my book to, encouraged me. He noticed I had a passion for clothing and fashion. And so I ended up doing a speech on a fashion event which took place, which was a competition between American and French designers. And that sort of became this catalyst, this central point of my life. And I met people who were involved in fashion. So that is really how I got involved. And I always loved the history of fashion. I love fashion, which literally means of the moment. But I like hearing how we got to that point and finding out.
For some people, fashion is viewed as trivial and superficial, not having much necessity or importance in our society. How would you challenge people with that mindset?
Well, first of all, on kind of an artistic point of view, I would challenge them and say fashion is the most artistic expression we can do every single day. So it's a necessity. So I don't think anyone would say food isn't a necessity, but we do need to be clothed, especially here in Rochester where it's a little cold.
Right.
But also fashion was the #1 industry in the city of New York before the financial business took over in the 70s, but it was also the #1 industry in our state. Fashion involves lots of different industries: transportation, agriculture, clothing. So I feel it's a form of expression of art, but also just industry in our country. It's a huge industry.
Well, you have worked and created special bonds with some of the most respected game changers in the world of American fashion, one being the late Eleanor Lambert, a publicity genius, credited for putting American fashion really on the global map. And I want to know, and I should point out, in Rochester, like many other cities around the globe, we have Fashion Week. And she is the one who's credited for creating this concept. And I want to know first, how did you meet Eleanor? And also explain her significance to the fashion world and our society.
Well, what I was talking about, that fashion show competition, was actually created by Eleanor Lambert. I had no idea of that when I was doing my research, but my teacher pushed back and said, well, you have a couple of newspaper articles about it, but you need to get more information. You have to do a live interview. So I interviewed a New York Times reporter who said to me at that time that Eleanor Lambert was the creator of this event and that I should call her, and I did. And later I met someone who was on his last day working for Eleanor Lambert when I was in college, and later he suggested that I go work for her, and I kept being surprised that she was still alive because I ended up working for her when she was 93 years old. And when you worked for Eleanor Lambert, you really didn't have time to know too much about what happened yesterday, much less today. She was always focused on the moment and what was happening next. And so one day she asked for something in the files, and I went to look in the files, and I said, "Did you know Halston?" And she said, "Well, I discovered Halston." So she was primarily she was an art student, and she was the first publicist for artists. And many of those artists she made famous in their lifetime, which had never really happened before. And that was in the 1920s. Then someone said, well, don't you think fashion is like art? And she agreed that in the hands of some, it was. And what she noticed was that her artist clients were from all over the world. Noguchi was Japanese American, Cecil Beaton was British, and they were well respected, but American fashion designers were considered the stepchildren of the fashion world, whereas the French designers were considered fantastic and looked up to. And what happened was that the US government could see that the war was coming. They knew the war was coming. And they started something called the New York Dress Institute, which was a collaboration of the Garment Workers Union, the state government, the federal government, and designers. And it was intended to keep the fashion business going during World War II. And they had a terrible ad campaign that said, "Aren't you ashamed not to wear a new dress?" And they had a dying soldier looking up at Martha Washington. But the department stores hated this ad campaign, and they suggested that the New York Dress Institute hire Eleanor Lambert. And Eleanor Lambert said publicity would be a much better way than these corny ads. And what she decided was to not, the editors of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar were those were the only two fashion magazines. And what she figured was you could bring editors from other towns. And Harper's Bazaar and Vogue didn't really care about American fashion. So she invited these other editors to come to town to see the collections of American designers. And that was the first Fashion Week. Not unlike Fashion Week now. She took them to Broadway shows, and there were 53 editors. And those Vogue editors and Harper's Bazaar editors certainly made their way to Fashion Week by the end of the first week. And what happened was Eleanor Lambert suddenly, within that first week, became the most powerful person in the fashion industry. So there had never been a Fashion Week before for editors. And so it was the press who then, these were women who were writing about cooking and cleaning, and now they were fashion editors. And she had convinced the publishers that perhaps the department stores would place ads if they wrote more about fashion, and all the publishers thought it was a fantastic idea.
I'm curious because you told me before that Eleanor really had to learn how to navigate this male-dominated world at a time when gender roles were very different than they are today.
Yes.
So how complicated was that for her?
In some ways, I don't think it was very complicated. Eleanor Lambert's husband was a very high-powered publicist. He worked for William Randolph Hearst. He was a publisher, I should say. And he was a publisher of one of the largest newspaper in America, the American Standard Journal at the time. And so he helped Eleanor a lot to navigate that world, but she was very smart. And she, I think one of the things is she just did her job, and she didn't really listen to designers. They would question her and have creative ideas, but she would not really push back. She just would go around them and do what she knew was the best way to do it. Also, I mean, I think she would flirt, she would smile, she would laugh, and she would shake her hand yes to the men, and then she'd just do whatever she wanted to do anyway. Okay. So she got things done that way.
Well, when we look at diversity and fashion now, gender and fashion now, there has been a little bit of backlash in our society just in terms of lack of designers of color, of all shapes and sizes, and of all abilities as well. And being featured whether on runways or in magazine editorials and retail stores, you name it. How do you view this issue, and what do you think necessarily has to happen in our fashion world to create more inclusion?
Well, I look to the example of Eleanor Lambert, who really, she never said it, she never talked about it, but she would say to designers, even when I worked for her in the 90s, oh, you might want to have a black, which is the term she used for African American, you might want to have a black model. You might want to use a black fit model. You might want to hire this great Latin kid I met at FIT. I think the people in power have to be pushing that. And I think you're starting to see that a little bit with some of the magazines, especially out of British Vogue and now Vogue. I think pushback wherever it starts then starts to snowball, where you see American Vogue letting Beyonce be the guest editor. And I think that that's exactly where it needs to come from. I think that sometimes we think it needs to come from the bottom, but it needs to come from the top. Eleanor Lambert was the most powerful person in fashion. So when she suggested something, like at the Versailles exhibition, it was her idea to hire half. There were 34 models representing America. Half of those models were not white. And she pushed for that. And she felt it was what was happening in the culture. So she wanted that to be reflected on stage. I think the people in power have to be very focused, and I think they have to be inclusive, and they have to do it themselves and not react to the audience. I think they have to be, I mean, fashion itself is about creativity and what's new, so not being safe.
Well, you do have a new book coming out in
I do.
2019, and that's focused on another incredible figure in the world of fashion,
Yes.
Don Mello. And so for viewers familiar with that famous store, Bergdorf Goodman, or the line fashion label Gucci, she is credited for saving and really reviving both. So what is it about Don that you have found to be so intriguing that you want to put into a new book?
Well, Eleanor Lambert was definitely not, she was strong but not silent. And I find Don Mello to be the strong and silent person of fashion. She was hired, she had worked for many years before she went to Bergdorf Goodman in the early 70s or mid 70s with a man by the name of Ira Neimark. They had worked together, and Ira Neimark knew that she was probably one of the most creative people in fashion for uncovering new talent. And so he hired her and he really nurtured her, and that's something that I really get into in the book on Don Mello. Was here's a person who was super creative, but had the support of strong men. At Bergdorf Goodman, Ira Neimark backed her, supported her, but she was always in the background. She was letting designers take a bow. She was finding the most creative designers and really challenging and changing society in New York when New York was in a really dark phase, and bringing new energy to fashion and fashion shows and retailing. And when she went to Gucci, she had another strong strong man behind her, totally chauvinistic, Maurizio Gucci, but who supported Don Mello and understood that Don Mello, and he stood back and let her do what she needed to do. So it's kind of an interesting commentary for Don Mello, which is this powerful, strong woman, yet she had men backing her who were saying she's really amazing. So you think, what happens if the men are jealous or are not supporting women? You know, someone like Don. But Don really understood audiences, and what she also understood was what they might not know they want, what was coming down. You know, for instance, when she brought Azzedine Alaïa to New York, women hadn't been wearing tight 40s style clothing, although the clothes weren't like the 40s, they were tight fitting clothes. And that ushered in the whole look of the 80s.
You will be featured on CNN in a special series airing next year focused on style for the last 100 years. So before we close, I have to ask you, how do you see style and dress evolving and influencing our society in the future, maybe 10, 20 years from now?
I think that technology has changed everything, first of all. I think that, and the people who run technology, the Silicon Valley people, they don't wear suits, they don't wear ties, they dress very casually, and I think that people can work from all different places. And I think that's one huge influence, is how we purchase fashion and how we interact with fashion versus going to a store or seeing it on the street as much as now we see everything online. I think there's been a huge amount of democracy brought to fashion, and we see really the preponderance of the American look, which is people being more casual and wearing more sportswear. And so I just think there's been a huge influence from technology and how we live our lives, that we can actually buy clothing on our phone.
Well, fashion historian John Tiffany, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was renowned fashion historian, author, and lecturer John A. Tiffany. To check out one of the runway shows or special events at this week's Fashion Week of Rochester, running now through Saturday, October 13th, be sure to go to fashionweekofrochester.org. And that wraps up another edition of Need to Know, Rochester's news magazine. I'm your host, Helene Bianduti Hofer. Thank you for joining me tonight and throughout the weekend here on WXXI. Have a great night.